So this is a great observation. I would say that there are a couple of scriptures that don't necessarily refute this concept, but perhaps they bring some completion to it. So if you go back to Genesis and look at when Noah's father named Noah, he said that we shall name him Noah because he will bring us rest from our toil. Then, after the flood, when Noah made the sacrifice and it pleased God, God said, I will never again curse the ground on behalf of man. So your observation about the flood being water baptism is absolutely spot on. And what I think we're seeing here is, if you look at the curse wasn't actually on man. The curse was actually on the ground. Whereas living by the sweat of their brow was actually a result of sin. Okay, so if we consider the flood as a form of sort of baptism, and we know that the curse was on the ground, and the flood water covered the entire ground. All of the ground of the earth was completely covered by water. And water baptism is a sign of death, right? It says that we are baptized into Christ's death. And so water baptism is a representation of going down into the earth and dying. Now, what we know about curses is that curses cannot remain after death. Once a thing has died, it is no longer under a curse. That's why it says that Jesus, when he died on the cross, he became a curse for us, but his death, see, the dying part is the thing that released him from the curse. And then he was resurrected in the spirit as something new. So the part that was cursed remained dead in the ground, but could no longer be under a curse because he was dead. So death releases from the curse. So if we kind of tie all this together with regard to the curse on the ground, what we have here is the curse being placed on the ground, a prophecy that Noah is going to bring rest to people from their toil, right, and dealing with the earth, the sweat of their brow, and the way that whole process works, right. And so there's a rest that is coming, and then we see this sort of baptism of the earth. Okay, and the ground specifically being entirely covered. And so the ground effectively died. And if the ground died, then it can no longer be under a curse. And then we get the affirmation that this curse has been released whenever Noah makes a sacrifice and God says, I will never again do this thing. Now, why would he say, I will never again do it if the curse still remained? It wouldn't make sense for him to even make any observation about it whatsoever, because it would just be continuing. And you wouldn't curse again something that remained cursed. You would only curse something again if that curse had been removed. Just in the same way that the flood, after he flooded the earth, he put the rainbow in the sky, and he used that as a sign that he would never again flood the earth. Why? Because the flood of the earth had been completed. And so never again will he do that process. So in the same way, you have the earth was covered, died, baptized, right? And you have a symbolism as well as an actuality. So the actuality is that the totality of the earth was covered in water. And then you have the symbolism of baptism, and that being kind of the first symbolism of baptism, removing a curse, or at least being a sign of the removal of a curse. Now, where I think your observation gets very interesting is there is this component happening here of Jesus' sweat turning into blood. And so there could be a way to correlate this, looking at it and saying the conversion of the sweat of his brow into the blood that clears us of the curse of sin. So you had the curse on the ground, which was removed by baptism, and then you have the curse of sin that is removed by the blood. And so perhaps you could look at it in that respect, where the economy of toil that we all sort of live under is correlated to the body still having to eat, to drink, to sleep, to do all the things that we have to do in order to survive, right? So there's a survival component that the curse on the ground didn't initiate the issue of the body being bound to death, right? Disobedience is the thing that initiated that. And so the curse of sin and death, that issue still attends to the body, even with the curse on the ground being removed. And so there's almost like two elements. It's like there's a sweat of the brow, and then there's what the sweat of the brow produces in the earth with like your thorns and thistles. You can remove the thorns and thistles, but the sweat of the brow still remains because we were still under sin. And so the transfiguration, the place where the sweat turns to blood, maybe we can look at that as sort of a prefiguring of what was going to happen at the cross, where we now have the ability to exit the economy of the sweat of our brow and enter into the economy of rest, which Jesus even says, right? Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, or whose souls are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest for your what? Souls. Right, and so maybe there's some additional correlation there. I definitely think there's a bigger mystery to that event that correlates, and I think there is a sequence. If one thing we know for sure is that there's been kind of this sequence of restoration that's been happening since the flood. The flood was kind of the beginning of that sequence of restoration, and then throughout the course of history, there's been these continual sequences of restoration. Christ being kind of the almost final sequence. So his sequence is the one that gives us the way to enter into eternity. And then of course you have like the final judgment, where all of sin is wrapped up, all of death is wrapped up, thrown into fire along with Satan and his fallen angels. And so that's kind of like the completion of the restoration of all things. And so we definitely see this sequence going, and God tends to prefigure everything that's happening in the spiritual in the natural, right? Just like you pointed out, that the water represents a baptism. And so you have that kind of doing almost like two prefigurations. So you've got this prefiguring of the concept of baptism, and then you also have, which prefigures the baptism that we did later, which is baptism into Christ. But it also is prefiguring the sequence of restoration as well that was going to come. So anyway, so long story short, I love this observation. I'm glad you made it, because there is some additional mystery in that particular event that I think merits tying together. And I may take some time to kind of look at that, because there's like a larger teaching here about entering into God's rest and living out of God's rest, and taking all of these different events in the earth that God has placed in the earth to prefigure these concepts. And so tying all of those together, including the transfiguration in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think that's a great, really critical sequence that merits being tied into this larger concept. So I may do a bigger teaching on that, tying all of these things together. So I'm glad you brought this up anyway. So yeah, thanks for the comment, and I look forward to your thoughts on future videos.